right, we're going to get going into just moving along here. Looking forward to this next panel because before this conference, I had not heard about quantum randomness at all or post quantum cryptography. So this will be, this should be an eye opener for sure. So I will let Henry take it away. Thanks.
That's right. We'll give you the best seat. Good morning. Happy to be here today. Certainly, we have a great lineup of speakers. You're wondering why Hong Kong Association, what is the connection here with mobile payment and fintech? Well, I'm going to share some information I think which might be useful to the audience. Actually, currently Hong Kong houses about close to 100 fintech startups from USA. Some of those startups are actually receiving subsidies and even funding from some of the established funds available from Hong Kong. So keep that in mind. Certainly, I'm a banker by profession, 37 years. Of that, 30 years have been in global cross-border business, both import-export financing, security clearance, as well as foreign direct investment, inbound and outbound. But you want to hear from the experts here today who are really, we have assembled a great team. And I would let each of them briefly introduce themselves and also the company that they are affiliated with, and then give you some idea. And then we'll jump right into the question that we have prepared, maybe a real case study that we can really, from one of the speakers, and then we'll dive into the discussion among the panelists. First, ladies. First, obviously, Reiho Liu, very accomplished leader and expert in data science. It's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Henry. This is Luis. I'm the co-founder of CB Payments. We're bridging the payment channels for e-commerce merchants. We have running this business for 4 years. So last year, we reached the 2 billion revenue. Currently, we already have more than 10,000 customers on business. And last year, I was listed by Forbes as the top 60 Chinese entrepreneur in North America. And I'm very happy to be here. And I'm very new to this conference. I know this conference has been running for a couple of years. In order to let you remember me, I will give you some keywords to tag myself. First, PhD. So I think I'm the only PhD on this panel. Second, I have a very strong international background. I got my PhD from Chinese Academy of Sciences, and then I did my postdoc from Yale University. And that's why I still have my office in New Haven, Connecticut. And third keyword is serial entrepreneur. CB Payments is my fourth startup. I have founded 3 startups before. The first one was founded 12 years ago, and it's dead. But the following 2 startups, I've successfully sold them out. So CB Payments is my first startup. And because I have tech background, but I know technology is technology. When I do my startup, I think I should be closer to the money side to get the cash flow first, and then harnessing the technology to make our customers more satisfied. And here on this panel, I'm more likely to learn from the other 2 panelists to see how they can provide a solution on the fraud prevention. Thank you.
Thank you, Reiho. I guess next to Reiho is Mansoor. You want to spend a few minutes?
My name is Mansoor Karimzadeh. I've been involved with payments for about 25 years. And in my early days, we implemented something called Mondex, which was exactly like Bitcoin of today, but it was on smart cards. And we implemented that in many different banks around the world. And at the end, they killed it because they were not getting their interchange fees, the card brands. But nevertheless, anyway, so we're working on different systems, EMV. What I tell people is that everything we do with payments is because of security, because of the problem with security. Everything that, if there was no problem with security, I can send you an email saying, pay Dale $10 and it'll go through, no problem. But because there is problem, because there is risk of fraud, everything to be created, all this encryption and decryption, all this other stuff that we use to secure our money. In recent 2 or 3 years, I've been involved with Professor Gideon Samid, who was here yesterday, and I'll talk about quantum computing and how we can make sure that we are protecting our transactions against quantum computers.
Last but not least, Andy or Andrew.
So Andy Degnan from Magtech. We're 50 years in the business of manufacturing devices for acquiring card data. We also run a payment protection gateway where we can take encrypted card data and authentication data and then pass that through, enabling the payments. A lot of our background is in the card present world, but in the card not present world, our experience through the gateway side of the equation is fraud is always going to be here. So you're going to hear the cynicism come from me right now. Fraud is always going to be a fact. It's always going to be something that we deal with. Unfortunately, it's a cost of doing business. And the best way I can describe fraud in the payment space is it's like a water balloon. You squeeze it, it's just going to move somewhere else. The threat actors are always going to be motivated to find information that they can use to make money. So part of what Magtech's philosophy is, we believe in really a 3-pillar approach to protecting sensitive information, whether it's payment information, PIN information, or just general information. And that is, and this seems like a very small thing when we hear about crypto and all of the other things that are happening in payments. So this is just one small piece of it, but it's an important piece. We have to protect the data that is already breached. And what I mean by that is, when it comes to payment cards or payment information, it's breached at the moment it's issued. It's on the cards, it's in the clear. But then we have to protect it at the point of use. The bad guys are out there stealing it left and right because they can use that static information to enter into the payment system through a variety of different points. So again, our philosophy is protect it at the earliest point possible with encryption, tokenize it so that we can deal with smaller amounts of data, but the real key pillar is authenticate. We must establish integrity and authenticity within a transaction from the beginning to the end. So I hope that's where my experience might lend a little bit of knowledge today, so thanks.
Excellent. I guess this panel is all about protecting your data and also preventing fraud. I would agree with Andy that fraud preparation or prevention is a cost, but on the flip side, being a banker, that can be your differentiator, really, in terms of standing out among your competition, being aggressively addressing fraud and turn it into a profit-making segment of the business. Now, with that, obviously, our experts here, I think they're going to share with you through the case study how a data-driven solution leveraging quantum randomness as well as PQC can actually help you prevent fraud. And first, maybe I'll ask, well, before I do that, I think you all heard about trust, building trust, integrity, protecting your data, privacy, and there are so many, I think, financial institutions in the audience, fintech companies. Certainly, the customer experience really start from very beginning when you first meet with your potential client, and then you have the onboarding experience, which is very key, all the way to the end in terms of monitoring and in growing your business. So obviously, payment is a critical part of it, and which is very important. But also, payment comes with other segments of business. I think regulation, RegTech is important, certainly, and also compliance, cybersecurity, and fraud prevention. Even some of the segments that using technology can help you price your products efficiently as well as right to the market, what customers want. So with that, maybe I'll start with Rehu in terms of maybe given from your experience, I know that you handle many, you process a lot of transactions the past few years, and certainly you can share with us maybe a real case example of a CNP fraud, cash not present fraud, and then based on that, maybe offer your comment in terms of how to prevent it, and then I will ask the two other speakers to jump right in terms of the technical aspects, some of the identification, or all those terminologies are way beyond a banker's apprehension. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I could share a true story based on my friend's company, who is also in the East Coast in the US. So last year, that is a financial institution. Last year, they suddenly jumped to the top 20 in that platform. With a lot of clients came, their data center got hacked, and some of their customers' data got leaked, which led about $100 million loss. And that is purely because of that is the responsibility from the company side. So the founders had to use their personal money to cover this loss. It's kind of like $100 million. And so from my perspective as a startup, so we have very limited budgets. How can we prevent the fraud happening? The fraud is endless. It's like you protect your house from someone stole money from your house. You can invest endless money into these unlimited fraud activities. So for my opinion, I think the most important thing is to protect our data center from the fraud, to get rid of the responsibility from ourselves first. And I have been reading papers on the current achievements. For example, some scientists have developed formal verification, so they can prevent the unknown software to read the hardware from the data center. I think that may be a technology we can use to prevent the fraud. And the second is, as the quantum computing is developing so fast, and with the brutal force, it can break a lot of the current fraud prevention logic. And we can use multiple dimensional verification to help us to get rid of the fraud. I think that may be the future.
Manju, I'm going to ask you maybe to elaborate a little more in terms of what went wrong with the cases, and then maybe offer some of your suggestions. For example, I know that you are very concerned about threats in terms of the payment system. What are the solutions? How we handle this? And it's all yours.
So let me start with quantum computers. Quantum computer threat is here now. IBM announced that by next year they're going to have a 1,000-qubit computer, and by 2025 they're going to have a 4,000-qubit quantum computer. With a 4,000-qubit quantum computer, you can break a PKI 2,000-bit key encrypted code in a few seconds. If you want to do it today, it takes you 1 trillion years. So it's here, it's going to happen here. So all the developments that we've been doing in the last few years has been to do that, to be able to be quantum computing safe. And one way of doing it is to not use encryption, to use random numbers. That's what we do. We use quantum random numbers, and we fuse that quantum random number to the card number, and we have a way of detecting if this combined fused data has been tampered with, stolen from somewhere, breached from somewhere, and we can detect all of this, and we'll tell the merchant or the issuer, whoever is authorizing the transaction, whether this is a good transaction or a bad transaction. Use cases, we are working with a number of large merchants in the US. One of them came to us. They have 3 use cases. They have the major use cases online. There's a lot of fraud online, especially after COVID or during COVID. So account takeover, stolen ID password, all of those things happen online. So we can authenticate the transaction, we can authenticate verify the device, we can authenticate the cardholder, and we can, over the air, without touching the internal transactions, and we can tell the merchant whether this was a good transaction or bad. This was the first case. The second case that they came to us was somebody walks into the store, a physical store, and they go and pick up a very expensive Chanel bag and go to the cashier and say, I want to pay for this. Oh, by the way, I forgot to bring my store card with me. And these stores' policy is that if they don't have their store card, they can identify themselves using their driver's license. And they already have made a fake driver's license. They say, here's my driver's license. They do the transaction. It goes through. And they walk out the door with the expensive bag. We can block that as well. We can, at the same time, we can authenticate that purchaser by sending a message to the real cardholder, to the genuine cardholder, saying, are you buying this $4,000 Chanel bag now? And they can say yes or no, and we would know if it is them or not. They had a third case. The fraudsters find out, or they go and buy something, they have stolen some information, they go and buy something online, and then later on they call the call center and say, I just bought this $1,000 fridge, but I want to give you a different delivery address. And they say, what's your name, what's your address? And they give them information, and the call center says, okay, fine, we'll reroute it to your new address. We can block that as well. So these are a number of cases. But in any case, all the things that we've been doing with Gideon Samid is based on random numbers. We don't use encryption, we don't use digital keys, and we think that's the future, because even if you extend your keys, make it more difficult, have a more complex algorithm, the quantum computers of 4,000 qubits is going to be 10,000 qubits. They're going to break it in a few seconds anyway.
Great. Well, Andy, I know that I had the privilege of at least watching your new product offering, and certainly I know Andy has been involved really heavily in this product introduction, and certainly I know Andy is very conscious about, in terms of the whole cycle, in terms of the customer experience, making sure that you build your trust, and then more importantly, the integrity of the entire transaction, as well as really how to protect individual information, as well as the public key infrastructure. Andy?
So it's kind of depressing to hear what Mansoor just said in terms of how the power of quantum computing in the post-quantum world really makes information that we have today, that's protected today, vulnerable, because it's steal now, decrypt later. And a lot of the information that we have in the payments landscape right now is protected under encryption schemes such as PKI, or private key, public key. And when you think about a private key and a public key is akin to a key that's basically in a phone book. It's public, and you keep a private key. And with the power of quantum computing, quantum computers will be able to factor through and determine what that private key is, and obviously then reveal the information. So there is an immediate threat now, even though we're waiting for those quantum computers to come. The data is being stolen now, and the threat actors know. Store it over here in a database somewhere, put it on a hard drive somewhere, and they'll decrypt it and monetize it at some point in the future. So at MagTech, we do rely on encryption, and we do rely on encryption around open standards. But we don't rely just on encryption. And really, I'll say the secret sauce to a lot of what we're talking about, it's somewhat of a thing I think a lot of people don't necessarily like to hear or believe in, but we've got some things that are diametrically opposed in the payment system. Customers want convenience, but they expect security. But nobody wants to be burdened with security until they're the victim of a breach of some sort. So those things are the things that are always going on. So when we think about, in a practical sense, are we waiting for a unicorn? It might never get here. We'll never have the optimum anything. And when I say we, our global economy, our society, our payments infrastructure, it just won't happen, because the threat actors are constantly motivated by the next big thing, the future of the future. So we're not looking to get to an end game, it's an evolution. So when we apply that and we think about some of the things that are going on, our philosophy is we do believe that we need to establish an authentic identity. And an authentic identity, as I heard someone talking about yesterday, having on and off ramps into the metaverse. One way to think about that is to bring something that can be authenticated in the physical world into the digital world. And that right there introduces friction. I heard somebody on one of the panels this morning saying, you know, with a new account being, a new card being used or a new account being established, you might get that phone call, and that's friction, and that's good. And the reality is, sometimes friction is good and necessary. And if we think we can come up with some frictionless experience and make it secure, we're sticking our heads in the sand. So I think, you know, bearing that in mind, we're trying to be practical. We're trying to chip away at the things that we can chip away, and ultimately what we're trying to do is mitigate the risk. But it's never going to go away, because there's the next big thing for the bad guys as well.
I think you're right. Actually, I think there's a point I want to make. You can never strike a balance between really having enough sufficient adequate security, fraud prevention solutions. There is no one size fits all, to be honest. I mean, this is so complex. And more importantly, earlier we talked about e-commerce. E-commerce will continue to grow leaps and bounds in the entire world, particularly from the emerging market economies. And we are better prepared. I mean, this is more than just payment, even though it's a payment conference. You know, with cross-border transaction that really exhibits a lot of complexity and difficulty. I mean, how do you compare regulations in Asia, in China, in Turkey, vis-a-vis our regulation? RegTech is very important, so obviously, and just for the audience sake, you know, there's a huge, really appetite and need for expertise in cybersecurity, in preventing fraud in the entire Asia-Pacific area because of the adoptions of really digital users. I mean, I can tell you, currently, I think, of the world's population, about 30 to 33% are digital users. A majority of those are actually in Asia-Pacific. Quite a large number in Southeast Asian economy, where there are more than 65% are underbanked population or underserved by financial institutions. So with that, I really maybe I'll open up a question, maybe really well we can answer, because some of the transactions are cross-border, right? Yeah. Can you share with us some of the concern that you know, from those cross-border transactions with U.S. and other parts of the world from your customers?
Yeah, so we do have some cross-border transactions. So currently we are still using very low technology to solve this problem. So we'll use a manually check on everything to make sure everything is done correctly. So that's why we still think technology may be the future to get this automation rather than just use human beings check. So currently our compliance team or our risk control team, we get an analyst to check that transaction day by day, and transaction by transaction is really, really time consuming and labor consuming. So that's why I think technology should be applied to it in the recent future.
I guess being the moderator, I have the luxury of asking questions. This question I've never been posing to the speakers. Actually, maybe Mansoor and Andy can address it. Just for my own curiosity, do we have currently a fully automated high technology monitoring system in terms of monitoring client customer activities, transactions to avoid fraud? Maybe this is too complex a question.
Yes.
You know, being a banker, obviously, you know, previously we were relying heavily on manual monitoring.
The system, just before our session, there was a previous session.
Yep.
A gentleman from Count was talking about. They do data analytics to detect fraud, and that's monitoring the actions of the customer. Every action, there are different ways of doing it. They do it some way, other people are doing it other way. But anyway, they track interaction between the customer and the bank, or the customer and the merchant, where they go, what they buy, how much they buy, how do they move their mouse on the screen. There are many different things they can track.
But my concern is sometimes there is manual involvement in those monitoring. And in a split second, the transaction could be really fraudulent. I mean, that's my major concern being a banker, because I've experienced a few in my 36, 37 years of banking that really...
Data analytics used to be after the fact. The transaction happened, fraud happened, and then they collected the data and they would analyze it afterwards. And then afterwards, and a week later, they would say, tell you what's wrong with it. Now we are getting near to the instant gratification.
So we are
within
close
a few
to
seconds,
being
yes.
dynamic. And Andy, any
Sorry.
thoughts?
No, so I think what is being said there in terms of the analytics are one aspect of it, and the transaction in real time itself, if we apply the three-legged stool, if you would, to the equation of we protect the data, we tokenize the data, but we authenticate the entire transaction from the beginning point to the end point so that all of the information that's flowing through, one, can maintain the integrity, but two, the endpoints can be established as authentic endpoints. And again, this is somewhat of a unicorn, but if all of those pieces of the equation are not authenticated, then you have one big giant man in the middle. When I do a face-to-face transaction, I have a reasonable assurance that I'm transacting with Mansour and we're exchanging something of value. As soon as I go into the digital world, I'm going across the internet through, again, the giant man in the middle. And the data leakage and how that data goes through the network in real time, trying to maintain the integrity of that transaction in addition to the analytics is the unicorn. So again, trying to get there, it's piece by piece, mitigating the risk where you can, but to try and solve that as one big problem, it's so complex, it is so disconnected yet connected, that it's not really practical to think that it could be done. So the best way is to chip away and find those points of vulnerability and mitigate the risk there where possible. And there are multiple ways to approach that.
Great. I think we have a few minutes, and maybe final thoughts from our speakers, panelists, in terms of the future, how we can address it. $1 million question. Who want to volunteer first? Final thoughts? We have a few minutes.
What did they ask?
Do we have any final thoughts? So
Yeah.
I'll say something quickly. So again, the post-quantum world, the quantum threats that we do face in terms of the sophistication, the speed, the efficiency at which threat actors will have access to. And right now, we rely on making information private through means of encryption, through means of other ways of protecting data. And all of that data should be treated as if it's been breached, because it's not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when. So having the approach of it's going to happen, the investment in the point of view of leveraging security as a competitive weapon, and I hate to use kind of those buzz phrases, it truly is important despite the fact that it might bring some friction to the equation. And if it brings friction and the friction is not worth it, then the fraud that results becomes a cost of doing business. So it comes down to the juggling act of what's the value in doing this and how much are you losing? And it's different across the payment landscape for different organizations. So fraud hurts some more than it hurts others.
Great.
Regarding the future, as Andy says, is inevitable, it's coming. Initially, anything to do with public key, private key is vulnerable because the quantum computing can break that. Even symmetric encryption will be vulnerable a little short while after that. And while I'm getting to all of this is, we had the previous session about cryptocurrency. Me personally, and our group, we have big problems with cryptocurrency, Bitcoin type cryptocurrency, and distributed ledger. All of this is based on PKI. Everything in Bitcoin and everything in the decentralized systems are based on PKI. And the day that the 4,000 qubit computer is active, they're going to break it within a few seconds. Sorry, there was a question over there somewhere.
Yeah.
And you can help prevent that through the use of multi-factor authentication, so encryption plus biometrics plus something else?
Yes.
I mean, you can make those same arguments.
Yes.
Right?
all of what you just said, multi-factor authentication is it. I mean, that's one thing. You have to authenticate the person. How are you going to do it? There's no other way. It's miles away somewhere else. So multi-factor authentication and biometrics. We have a big problem with biometrics because if biometrics is stolen, you cannot change your fingerprint. If somebody steals your fingerprint, they can go and use it, and you cannot change it. So we are coming up with solutions that will make your fingerprint or biometrics dynamic somehow. In fact, Professor Samit has another couple of patents on that. We are not using it yet because we are too busy doing this other stuff. But you're right, yes. Dual-factor authentication is one good way of doing it. And in fact, in European countries, it's a must. It's a law that you have to use two-factor authentication.
I'd say just one thing, not necessarily just two-factor, but multi-factor.
Multi-factor. All right.
So there are a lot of ways to approach that. And again, some might have better application for, again, some than others. There's no one-size-fits-all to everything. The reality is, the one thing that is constant is there are always threats to data privacy, sensitive data that can be monetized. And how can we stay ahead of that in the digital world? And there are a variety of ways to do it. So again, at MagTech, we believe in dynamic data. We believe in a dynamic token that will help establish a digital identity. And again, that's kind of the on-ramp, off-ramp from the physical world that is the bridge to the digital world. Without that bridge, if we're living entirely within this metaverse, there is one threat vector, the metaverse. As soon as we establish multiple metaverses, those threat vectors become much more difficult for the bad guys to simultaneously attack or separately attack, but then to combine their stolen data so that they can make use of it at some point in the future. And they do. It's not necessarily that they steal it now and use it now. They'll steal it now and sit on it, and they'll use it when the time is right.
Where you are, you have final thoughts? No.
So I want to share that currently we already have more than 10,000 business clients who are focused on the e-commerce merchants, and we are really very eager to collaborate with other business partners, either for the fraud prevention or to serve them with better products. For example, if you can collaborate with this e-commerce merchants, feel free to reach me out, and we're really open for that.
I think we're right at 10 o'clock. And actually, my last thought is, let's hope that we are not going to be victims of fraud, even though looking at the population, 10%. So there are many solutions available, and a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.